Hopalong Cassidy. All right, well, let's come back together, everyone. Gotta make sure my sound's on here. Chapter 39 gets us back into the narrative that focuses us on the household of Jacob. So we're back to the question of, where are these sons? We've got the 10 sons and the younger 2, Joseph and Benjamin. Now we're going to meet up with Joseph and pick up where the narrative left off in verses 1 through 3. Let's have Jinseo. Could I have you read, please? Oh, wait. Are you ready? Let's see. Is she not here? Okay, never mind. Let's see. I called on. How about Deanie? Let's have you read. Chapter 39, verses 1 through 3.
Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, had the captain of the guards, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything he did successful.
Okay, so let's just pause there. What we're going to see here, and this is the kind of the argument that I make in the book I'm forcing you to read, is this. The theology of testing in the Joseph narrative applies 2 ways. We're going to have the early part of the Joseph narrative, and what we have here is, I would argue, implicit testing of Joseph. So his experience in Egypt, this early part of chapter 39 is going to give us some insight into Joseph's refining experience. And then what we're going to have is another part of the narrative that focuses on I would argue, the 10 brothers. And this idea of testing, as I've said before, gets to the heart of brotherhood and loyalty. So when the divine agenda behind all of this is what the Lord is doing and what the Lord is up to. And what we see in the Joseph narrative, it's going to focus us on the testing of an individual as well as a group of individuals. And this idea of testing gets us into the idea of refining, and you see in the picture the refining of gold, and what the Lord himself is most interested in, and that's and I've drawn this picture before, the heart, which is the faith or loyalty or trust of his individuals. In this case, a group of people. We're going to have two testing situations going on. And what's interesting about this testing dynamic in the Joseph narrative is how it would have been understood and appreciated from the audience. Moses speaking to Israel. And in the testing idea, what Israel would have experienced as a nation. When were they tested? We'll see it pretty soon when we get into the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers. 40 years in the wilderness, right? They're going to have their testing experience, their refining experience, their experience of having their faith pushed to the limit. The transformation that's necessary from the wilderness generation 1 to the, after 40 years, wilderness generation number 2. Generation number 1, they're not ready to enter the promised land, as we'll see. They have to be transformed, and a generation emerges who have learned the lesson of the wilderness through the experience of refinement or testing. So another way I refer to you may hear me refer to the testing experience as a kind of a wilderness experience. Isn't that the way the Lord works in our life, right? And it's oftentimes the thing that the Lord wants most of all is to see our faith refined or tested. And the Lord uses the adversity in our lives and around us sometimes that we're, He doesn't take us out of those situations. We walk through them. We look like this as we're walking through the storms of life. You hear it referred to in different ways. So what's interesting is the individual Joseph, we'll see here in the text, is going to be tested and refined. I would argue, even though the word testing doesn't show up, Joseph was tested. We don't see that in the text, but it's implicit in the experience that we see. He's going to emerge through his testing experience, and he's going to be then useful by God in some pretty significant ways. So I'll just keep you in suspense. We'll look at some of the details here. Joseph's going to be in Egypt, and we see already the emphasis. And one of the things that's true and never changes through a testing or refining experience, I just should write up the word test. And we see this in the details of the Joseph narrative. You see that the Lord was with Joseph, right? You see that in verse 2. The Lord is causing him to be a successful individual in the household of Pharaoh, verse 2. Where do we also see this? As Joseph is being blessed by the Lord, we see that overlap of that extending into the household of Pharaoh in verse 5. Even after the conflict with Pharaoh's wife, which we think is a huge setback to the whole operation of Joseph kind of rising with responsibility, significant responsibility in the household of Pharaoh, we see it over in verse 19. Even in his imprisonment, verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer, verse 23, did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. What's something that we can, if we know somebody that's going through testing, what can we always say is true? They're a believer, right? The Lord has not abandoned you, although it may feel like it. No, the Lord's not abandoned. And that's what we see here in the Joseph narrative. Whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. So that's a little bit of what we see in the Joseph narrative in the early part of the book of the story of Joseph. It's this idea of testing. So what we have is this, interestingly, the adversity caused by natural events such as famines. We see already the famine that's predicted in the dreams of Joseph. Let's see, I don't want to jump ahead here. But as Joseph rises in responsibility in the house under the household of Pharaoh, what's significant is Joseph's going to be in charge of what I call famine relief efforts for that time period. We have to recognize and remind ourselves the Egyptians, or Egypt, was the breadbasket of the world at that time because of the Nile River. And that's where they're growing grain. And when famines happen, which would be widespread famines, the people around, nations around Egypt would have friendly terms and allow people to come in and purchase famine relief grain from Egypt. So Joseph's going to move into a role of overseeing that. And as a result of rising through his testing experience and experiencing what it's like to experience adversity, but yet trusting in the Lord and always emerging as one in this picture here. So that's what we can say about Joseph. I think I shared my testimony before. One thing I can say about this idea of testing is that oftentimes the one thing that might be the precipitating event to our personal experience of testing and refining, God will refine and then sometimes even use as ministry potential down the road. For me, the irony is when I was fired from ministry, it was because of my lack of ability to do administration, which also involved my lack of understanding how to fit into an authority structure for a large church, which burned my bridges when I came back from the mission trip. I think I told that story last time, yeah. So all that was going on, but the irony, I was telling Weston earlier that I got my foot in the door in administration when I was doing my MDiv work up in Louisville, and that just started like Joseph, just grew. And I didn't know it that I'd be good at administration and serving and helping an institution be successful in a lot of different things, but that's what I started to do. And when I was needing to use my network and find a place to serve and land and serve in ministry, the boss that I had at that time remembered me and said, I've got a job for you to do down in Texas. So I moved my family made that long 900-mile trek down to Texas. And now I'm doing administration, which, way back when was the very thing that got me in trouble in ministry. So I think that this refining experience, we maybe it's something we should expect. God calls us to ministry. sometimes we all come to ministry with some rough edges that need to be refined out. And I think that's helpful to understand. All of us who are preparing for ministry or are currently in ministry, we may be in a situation right now where the Lord's not abandoned us, but he's overseeing a refining experience. He wants to take off some of those rough edges so that we're more useful, like Joseph, in serving the divine agenda that he has for us. All right, so chapter 42. This is one of my favorite chapters. I've spent a lot of time looking at this. Let's just kind of walk through it and understand what's behind now the testing that Joseph is going to be giving to his brothers. But remember, Joseph's an extension of the divine hand. So if Joseph now has been tested, God's going to use him. And what we'll see is when Joseph's testing the brothers, what's really behind that is the divine concern, God's concern, or the Lord's concern for the future of this group here. So that's what we see going on in chapter 42 as kind of the center for testing. Let's see, where are you? Mitch, could you read for us in chapter 42, verses 1 through 6?
When Jacob learned that there was no grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground.
So we see a little bit of the fulfillment there, one of Joseph's earlier dreams in terms of the bowing that takes place. We see some of the details come in. The 10 brothers, notice the emphasis on 10. The 2 younger, one Joseph and one Benjamin. What we have to remember here in this early part of chapter 42 is Joseph's not fully aware of the well-being of his younger brother Benjamin. So this is going to play out in this tightly woven narrative, really, is what we're looking at. Joseph's rank here in terms of the household, serving in the house of Pharaoh shows up in terms of famine relief efforts. Joseph's organizing these efforts, and this is what we have. A famine is going to drive the household of Jacob down in kind of an act of desperation and hopefully able to bring back some relief. So all of this is, you might say, part of the divine kind of orchestration of events, pushing sometimes through adversity, though, but pushing his people in the direction that he wants them to go. Now, Joseph responds, somewhat of a shock here we see in verse 7. Why don't you keep reading there, Mitch, for us in verse 7.
Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. They said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them, and he said to them, "You are spies who have come to see the nakedness of the land." They said to him, "No, my lord, your servants here come to buy food."
Well, let's pause there. This is kind of an interesting response. Depending on what commentary you pick up off the shelf in the library, some critical scholars will go hog wild into this idea that this is an example of Joseph being mean and vindictive against his brothers, acting as a selfish, spoiled brat. That's what you'll read in some of the commentaries. So it just kind of goes to show it's a hard narrative to try to interpret and kind of get your heart and mind around, is this Joseph narrative. But I think I would argue against that idea. I don't think Joseph is acting as mean and vindictive at all. This is part of the divine agenda to move this group of 10 brothers in the direction that they need to go. They're the ones that are in the sights of being tested now. So obviously, if Joseph blows his cover early, this may not happen in the way that it needs to. And his accusing them of being spies is part of Joseph's agenda here to, you might say, turn up the heat of testing. Testing, or that refining idea, you think of it generally is what's required is heat. Heat to melt, heat to get the attention of. the heat that comes from, the storms of life and all of those things, sometimes melt away the unnecessary things so that we get down to the kernel of what's really true and what's really important for God. So I think that's a little bit about what's going on. Now what we see here, verse 9, you are spies, you have come to look at the undefended parts of our land. They said, notice the language that we see in the text. This is what I think is we're kind of getting close to this idea. Joseph's interested in, as well as the Lord, who's interested in this idea of brotherhood. But the language or the response from the brothers, they said, no, my Lord, but your servants have come to buy food. And notice in verse 11, we are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies. So this son, one for all, what's the phrase? Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. Kind of language starts to show up here in the narrative. We're brothers. And he says, no, you've come to look at the undefended parts of the land, verse 12. But they said, your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. Verse 13, behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more, which would have been Joseph. And Joseph says to them, it's as I said, you are spies. And here's the language of testing. By this you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, ye shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. So send one of you, that he may get your younger brother, while the rest of you remain confined, so that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. So one of the things that comes out of the mouth, I'm going to be kind of creative here, this little, whatever the words are, here's what we're saying, and in order to validate or verify that the words are true, you have to put feet to them to demonstrate that what's come out of your mouth is lining up with what reality is. So this is part of the idea of the validation idea that I develop in the book, and the Hebrew word that is translated test in this context is kind of a unique word, and I get a little creative with an appendix that traces it back to actually an Egyptian idea that comes out of Egypt, interestingly, as another way of saying testing, this idea of the touchstone. I may have said this before, I can't remember, but the touchstone idea, in the ancient world, they would have a field check test for gold purity, and they'd have black stones that they would rub gold nuggets on, and by the color of the streak left behind, they'd be able to basically do a quick check to see where the purity of the gold is, basically on the nuggets that they'd literally pick up off the ground. Gold was in abundance in Egypt as well. So this touchstone idea, I develop in my book with regards to this testing concept as a kind of a, this touchstone, kind of a quick check or spot check for validation for what you're after of testing, and that's the idea of the validation of brotherhood. So this idea might help us understand a little bit more in the Joseph context. All right. So where does this go? We'll just keep we'll keep all 12 of you behind. Send one of you to get your younger brother and bring him back to validate that this younger brother is actually alive. I think this is part of Joseph's concern. He's got two concerns, Joseph does. One, has this group of 10, the 10 brothers, have they treated Benjamin like they treated me? See, that's one of his concerns. Number two, Joseph's concern, will this group of 10 brothers leave behind another brother like they did me? So possibly two concerns going on here. And this is what Joseph's after. Brotherhood and loyalty. Has this group of 10 brothers learned the lesson of brotherhood and loyalty to the household, to the family? So Joseph in verse 18. Now Joseph said to them on the third day, do this and live, for I fear God, which is an interesting declaration, even though it comes out of Joseph's mouth. We saw the declaration of Abraham as one who fears the Lord or fears God. So this idea of fearing God, oftentimes tracks well with the one who's been tested. So in my book, I make that argument that Joseph's implicit testing is validated and kind of backed up by this language of fearing God. Because one who goes through the testing experience is oftentimes comes out of it and then is identified as one who fears the Lord. So that's another thing that kind of connects with testing. Verse 19, if you're honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison. But as for the rest of you, go carry grain for the famine of your households. It's interesting that even in verse 19, we see Joseph being kind. See that? It's a lot more famine relief grain to be carried back by at least 9 of the brothers as opposed to just 1 for the household of Jacob. But what that also does, this is a very complicated narrative, I know, but let's leave behind 1 brother, send away the 9, and see what the 9 do. How will they respond? Will they abandon him? You see where this is going? So this question of leaving behind Simeon, is a lot like the situation that this group of 10 had left behind Joseph before with his situation. He wants to find out what they're going to do. Have they learned? Are they really a group of brothers, or are they still prone to leaving behind a brother for their own personal advantage or gain, or just so this is a situation that he's pushing them into as close to an identical situation as he had for himself. And that's what we have here. But he wants to test to see not only are they a group of brothers truly, but also verse 20. How did they treat the youngest brother, Benjamin? Bring your youngest brother to me so your words may be verified and you will not die. And they did so. And then you start to see the ramifications of the personal struggle when the pressure cooker starts to cave in a little bit and the pressure starts to increase. They say to one another, verse 21, another, we're guilty concerning our brother because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. Reuben says, didn't I tell you guys? You didn't listen to me back then. And we go down to verse 25. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to restore every man's money in his sack and to give them provisions for the journey. And thus it was done for them. So they loaded up their donkeys with their grain and they parted from there. As one of them opened his sack and to give his donkey food or fodder, and at the lodging place, he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of his sack. Then this only amplifies it, right? And he says to them, my money's been returned, and behold, it's even in my sack. And their hearts sink as they turn trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? So it's very dramatic. So Simeon is, he's held hostage. Well, that sounds harsh, but he's held back by Joseph. So this is what we have going on here. So Joseph's test is here again is intended to really push his brothers into a pressure cooker situation, to really validate and verify where they're going to, how are they going to respond to this situation with regards to one brother being left behind. So the rest of chapter 42, what we have here is a family in chaos, and then the father, Jacob, is going to get involved, and he's desperate, right, as the head of household to preserve this household, not another son. I'm not going to lose another son, is basically his response. Now we transition to chapter 43, and what we have is an indication or a kind of an ambiguous time signal in the very first verse. You see a repetition of the phrase that we saw earlier at the beginning of, at the end of chapter 41. There was a famine that was severe in the land. Chapter 43, verse 1, now the famine was severe in the land. Now, I think, and I'm wondering what this tells us about the brothers. There might be a little bit of a clue here. So they're all back, the 9. The 9 brothers are back with their household head, Jacob, the father. And it seems that as if, and I would argue, time has passed. This might be, I have to look at it again, but I think that another famine is might be a continuation, or it might be a more, scholars go back and forth on this. I think it might be another indicator that time has passed and another famine has risen up. So the need is for someone to go get us some famine relief grain again. And what we see here, Simeon is still in Egypt. You see, time has passed, which basically signals that there's inactivity amongst this group. They've not done anything for some time. It seems as if another famine is necessary to get them to move or to remember, oh, we better do something about Simeon. So again, we get back to our word ambiguous. What are they doing? Are we looking at another situation where they're abandoning another brother because of inactivity? So what would a group of brothers have looked like in this situation if they were truly brothers? Well, let's not wait for another famine to go back to Egypt and get our brother back. We need to follow through with what this guy told us to do. This is what we need to do. We need to get Benjamin and act quickly here so no harm befalls Simeon back in Egypt. We can't abandon another brother. That's not what we see here. That would be my argument. So it's a little subtle there, but you can look at it and agree with me or disagree with me and be wrong. So, so we see, let's see here. Finally, though, they return with Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother. Finally, the activity does happen. Joseph has closure now with his first concern. Remember, there were two. How's Benjamin? And where's the brotherhood? So in chapter 43, let's move over to verse 26. Well, not quite yet. Well, Joseph sees Benjamin there in around verse 16. But let's look over at verse 26. So this is kind of, now they're back. The 9 have come back. There's Simeon. Joseph came home. When Joseph came home, verse 26 in chapter 43, they brought into the house to him the present which was in their hand and bowed to the ground before him. They asked him then he asked them about their shalom, or their welfare, and said, "Is your old father well, of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" You see in Joseph's language, he's ongoing concern, I think, is consistent with his character. He's not being a brash bully. He's being concerned for the household. And they said, "Your servant, our father, is well. He's still alive." And they bowed down in homage. And he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. He said, "Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me?" And he said, "May God be gracious to you, my son." Joseph hurried out, for he was deeply stirred over his brother, and he sought a place to weep, and he entered his chamber and wept there. So this is an emotional, moving response that Joseph gives on the closure of his concern number 1. How's my little brother doing? Finally, he has closure. And it seems as if, let's see. But now we see that Joseph focuses his concern now on his second concern with a little bit more of a focused test with regards to this testing idea. And that's what we see here in the details of the narrative. With the cup placed in Benjamin's sack, now he's sending them back. Upon their return, this will implicate the youngest son, Benjamin, whom will remain in Egypt as a slave as a result. Just like Joseph before, who was a slave. And in chapter 44, verse 17, so there's the implication in verse 17. "Far be it from me to do this. The man in whose possession the cup has been found, he shall be my slave. But as for you, go up in peace to your father." So Benjamin has been technically caught, although he was set up by Joseph, but not to be mean and vindictive or revengeful as a brother. He's now pushing this group as far as he can. Is this group of 10 brothers going to leave behind not just any son or any brother, but a particular brother, aka Benjamin? See, that's now the focus. Now specific on a son of the mother Rachel. So we see a kind of a bright ray of hope with the dialogue that we have here at the end of chapter 44. Judah's going to step in now. And he's going to offer a pretty long speech here of recounting the events and the dialogue that takes place. But we see a theological high point, I think, in the ray of hope idea in verse 33 and 34 in chapter 44. Let's have, let's see, Benjamin, could you read back here? Could you read for us in chapter 44, verse 33 and 34?
Now please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave. In place of the boy, let him go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father without the boy? I could not bear to see the grief that would overwhelm my father.
Okay, so Judah, excuse me, Judah's stepping in here, and it seems as if now we're starting to see a little bit of a crack. Maybe this refining experience is moving at least Judah anyway. Whether or not he's representative of the whole group leaves it, that's somewhat of the ambiguity of the situation, but at least he's speaking for himself. Finally, we see a brother concerned for another brother with the intent of not leaving behind, right, another brother, and also seeking the shalom or the welfare of the whole household. So let's move on to the next slide. So now we have a moving scene of reconciliation. In chapter 45, we turn to verse 1 through 8. Now he's seeing something, right? There's an interesting, we track closely with the emotional responses of Joseph. Joseph could not control himself before all of those who stood by him, and he cried, "Have everyone go out from me." So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it. And the household of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph says to his brothers, there's the language of loyalty, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. And Joseph says to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." They came closer, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." Now we get into the theology here that's going to bring us to, I think, the Romans 8:28 of the Old Testament that's found here in the end of the chapter, but it starts to show up here. So I'm going to make the connection. Don't be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. So there we see the theology of the divine hand, the divine agenda, and how is it that God can somehow eke out good in a bad situation? We start to see it, and he continues on for the natural disaster, right? The famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. There's 7-year famine. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance or escape. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he's made me a father to Pharaoh, the Lord of all of his household and ruler over all of the land of Egypt. So you see Joseph recognizing how through his testing experience, how the Lord was working and was with him and positioned him in a unique place for extending not only blessing or shalom or good to the immediate household of Jacob, but as we'll see, the nations around, the peoples around who were impacted by the famine also benefited as well. So this is an important. So Genesis 45, 5 through 8, this is like the Romans 8:28 of the Old Testament. And we'll kind of jump ahead. We'll get to it right now, I think. So moving kind of quickly here for the rest of what we see is the family go back, the brothers, and they're going to bring Dad home, and everybody's going to go into Egypt. Jacob is going to be in his old age and is seeking a place basically to die, but to be buried back at the land of Canaan. He's going to have blessing on his sons in chapter 49. One place I want to kind of bring as a high point is in chapter 49, verse 10. We see a specific detail with regards to the blessing in chapter 49, verse 10, in his blessing of Judah. Jacob says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." It's an interesting extension there. I think we can connect it back to the promised T of Genesis 3:15. So now we see more color filled in with regards to who is this one going to be? Where is he going to come from? What's going to be the line of Judah? The scepter, there's a reference here to royalty or to, king, what a king would hold. So this king idea kind of begins, and we start to see it emerge. If we look at Psalm 72, verses 8 through 11, this is another parallel idea of the coming Messiah who would come. Genesis is going to end in chapter 50 after we see the death of Israel, or the death of Jacob in chapter 50. We come back to what I'm sorry to say is a little bit of ambiguity here at the end. And here's where I'll show you after the death over here in chapter 50, beginning in verse 15. So after verse 14, after he had buried his father, Joseph returns to Egypt, he and his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. Verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph should bear a grudge against us and pay us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him?" What kind of question is that? What kind of person or persons does that question come from? Yeah, where are they at with regards to brotherhood? That question come naturally overflow from a group of brothers who have come to grips with their brotherhood. So they sent a message in verse 16 to Joseph saying, "Your father charged before he died, saying," quote, now they're quoting Dad, or are they quoting Dad? "Thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. And now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father." And Joseph wept when he spoke to them. See, there's the emotional response again. Whenever Joseph responds emotionally, something significant has some transactions taken place. So we have to ask ourselves, is this really what Jacob said? Or is this a group of 10 who are seemingly resorting back to some of their early deceptive techniques? Are they putting words in the mouth of their deceased father? Joseph weeps. Why is he weeping? My hunch is that Joseph was hoping to see brotherhood, but with something like this, he knows full well this is a group of brothers that not only do they not get it with regards to me, as if Joseph has to demonstrate one more time his loyalty to them in the household. He's been providing for them every step of the way. Joseph's been consistent in providing for the shalom of the household of Jacob. He's not backed away from that at all. He's been consistent through the whole Joseph narrative. Why are they calling that into question? Joseph's emotional response was to weep and to grieve. Well, he's not seeing brotherhood yet. So that's part of I think, the ending of the book of Genesis. However, notice the theology, how Joseph responds. And this gets us back to the earlier section that we talked about. How can God work through a situation like this? But Joseph says to them in verse 19, this is the key, "Don't be afraid, for am I in God's place? But as for you, you meant bad against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result and to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I'll provide for you and your little ones." So he comforts them and he speaks kindly to them. More work to be done. Maybe there's an appendix that we'll find, maybe something else. Where do these brothers go from here? Well, the book of Genesis ends, and then we'll pick up with the book of Exodus after our break. But that's the theological idea of the idea, I think, for Israel, understanding the Joseph narrative, and it was written and intended for them, Moses being the author. The theology of the Joseph narrative is, I think I can make a case largely centered on this idea of testing. That seems to make sense, and testing and how God works through the adversity that sometimes is brought into a situation of moving God's people. Sometimes God raises up individuals as agents, but sometimes they themselves need to be refined themselves so that they're most useful. But then the idea of Joseph that he gives us here at the end, God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result. I think that, and I may have said this before, but if we go back to Romans 8, and we see Paul's development of this idea in the New Testament context, before we get to Romans 8:28, what do we see in the early part, right? We see the reference there in Paul's development of the idea of suffering, and the fact that if you're in the family of God, if you call yourself a child of God, you're gonna suffer. Suffering is going to be your experiencing, but I want to make sure I get it correct. We'll end with this and then we'll have our break. Romans 8. Paul develops a very parallel idea in Romans 8. Paul says, if you're children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that is Christ, in order that we may be glorified with him. So it's interesting, if I thought about this a lot, the parallel idea of suffering with him so that we may be glorified with him. If that's the good that comes as a result of suffering. Notice what Paul says after this. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So this revealing of the glory is the idea that I see as kind of and that comes before Romans 8:28. For we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose, even if the one's experiencing adversity and suffering. Good comes from suffering because it's connected to glory, and glory comes through suffering. So there's glory that's manufactured as a result of our suffering, looking like this, right? And that's something that comes out of it. It may be not a present reality, but it's something that's future, at least, and something that we look forward to. All right, well, let's pause there and we'll come